We're continuing our Love Under Construction series here this morning. So if you haven't been with us, we've been talking about love, sex, and relationships is the series. And so we talked about what is love, all the different types of relationships that we may find ourselves in and trying to navigate following Jesus simultaneously. And today, this is the second to last week, and today we're going to talk about the sex part of the love, sex, and relationships. Now don't get anxious, okay? This isn't like the boundary talk from your parents. This isn't a how-to thing, okay? We're talking about the heart of sex in the Bible and for relationships and God's design and desire for the gift of sex to be utilized. And so, we're talking about that. I know you guys are probably thinking like, oh, great planning, Chris. It's Mother's Day. You just baptized your mom, and now you're going to preach to her about sex. I mean, this was just anointed from the get-go. I realized that. So now that we got that elephant out of the room. So, having a few years under my belt as a campus minister and also being on the University of Oregon campus as a student, as a religious advisor, being around younger people, but also it's not just young people on the college campus these days, and being in community and actually doing relationship with people and having conversations, I've had some very interesting conversations with students, professors, community members, even church members about this topic of sex. You can imagine that if I step onto a campus and I'm going around asking people like, hey, I got some questions for you. Just want to talk to you about some pretty controversial things. This God guy and this Jesus guy, I want to ask you some questions about it. That if you were that honorary student, like freshman, sophomore in college, and you just wanted to shut me up, like you'd probably just go there right away, right? Like, okay, let's talk about sex, Mr. Christian guy on campus. Like, because you figure at least that's going to end it and we can get out of this conversation and move on. So with that groundwork being set, you can imagine what some of the conversations, as we go out and try to intentionally have conversations about Jesus with people, what those look like. They can look a lot of different ways, but some of the most interesting conversations I've had, and probably the most prevalent train of thought is this. That people think that, especially like in this culture, in the Northwest, that sex is just a personal decision or a personal expression. It's just my thing, leave me alone. It's like an appetite. It's like food. I'm hungry, I eat, right? Like it's just a function of the body that you satisfy if you have a need. A lot of people feel that there is nothing inherently wrong or right, moral or immoral about sex. That it is what it is. And that as church and as people who follow Jesus, our Christian ethics are just straight out outdated and irrelevant. That would be the dominant ideals that I run into in these conversations. And we try to proclaim the good news that Jesus is Lord over your life. And yes, that also means your sexuality and your intimacy. And people cannot understand, like, how is that good news that you say that Jesus is even Lord over, like, your sex life, your sexuality? And it throws people for a loop. And if I'm going to be honest, I can understand why. Because the church, people who associate themselves with Jesus and Christianity, the message about sex is often don't, right? In the church, it's often don't. Don't look at porn. Don't sleep around. Don't have sex before marriage. Don't whatever act of sexual deviance you want to throw in the blank. It's just a message of don't. And so if, as a church, we just tell everybody what not to do and give them rules and expectations, but don't tell them why, how can we expect them to understand, like, the heart behind intimacy and love as God designed it? But also, how can we expect them to believe that it's good news that, like, Jesus is Lord over that and has a design and a plan for that? If all we do is no, 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 and don't give reasons why or what the bigger picture is about. So I can understand, because knowing the why is extremely important, isn't it? I'm running through this as I learn to parent, and I will never learn how to parent like how I think God designed. Like, I'm always going to be on a progression trying to figure this thing out, because if any of you have gone through this journey before, every day poses a new obstacle, and when you think you have one thing figured out, like, then another season comes in, another behavior, another manifestation of a child's emotions that they don't know how to contextualize happens. And we're always on this journey. But what I have learned is that if I just tell my kids what not to do, parenting quickly becomes about behavior management and not about addressing their heart. Not about addressing their heart. And we must address the heart of this issue if we want, like, Jesus to be able to come into people's lives, for them to accept his design, his intent for it, so that transformation, healing, and hope can be experienced in our community. If we only learn the rules and the reasons, I believe we become morally stunted. We become unable to navigate this sea of gray that's all around us. If we just know don'ts and we don't know the whys, when we're encountering a unique or a new situation, we don't know how to navigate that. If we have not been given a set rule or a process for that exact situation, then we flounder. But if we teach people how to think critically and we love on people and make disciples that know the reason why about things, then they can navigate this sea of ambiguity and gray that we find ourselves in reality. We got to teach people how to think, the heart behind these things. Also, if all we do is talk about rules, we come across as judgmental when we should come across as gracious. And we seem unloving when we should seem understanding of what people are dealing with their situation. So this brings us to the point where, like, there's got to be a better way, right? Like, great, yeah, I get it. Don't just say don'ts, like, let's tell them why. So I want to walk through, like, an understanding of the whys of this gift of sex and intimacy, how it's meant to be expressed, how it's been designed, so then we can address that in our interpersonal relationships, and even more importantly, in our own relationships, and see Jesus enter in and transform our lives. You see, at the end of the creation story, God everything stops, and he just looks at his creation. He says, it is very good. Everything was good. Good in Hebrew is the word tov. The essence of this word is that things were good, beautiful, and working as they were supposed to. They were brought into order and all working as they were supposed to. So at the end of creation, God has designed, set everything into motion, and he stops and says, this is good. This is great, beautiful, and as it's supposed to be. Tov is the perfect order being established. It's something that appeals to all five senses. So it's like the taste of good food, the sound of some good live music on a Friday night. It's your favorite concert. It's a nice warm fire on a chilly winter night. Like, all senses, everything is just right and good and as it's supposed to be. This is Tov. And sex is Tov. In the right context. God designed it to be beautiful, good, and complete, and in perfect order. Everything we call sex, from beauty, attraction, desire, touch, making love to your wife, all of this is good. It's tov. It's tov. It is as it's supposed to be. The first command in the Bible, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, I think, is what? To be fruitful and multiply. In other words, make love to your wife. Like, that's a pretty good command, if I do say so. Like, I can roll with that. Like, be fruitful and multiply. Like, I'm down with this God thing, right? So from the beginning, this was something that was meant to be good and to accomplish something. It's the problem with the church handling this is that we have a shopping list of do's and don'ts. But the Bible does not start with a don't. It starts with a do. It starts with a positive command to be fruitful and multiply. And it says in Genesis 2:25 that Adam and Eve were naked and felt no shame, none at all. So this concept of nakedness isn't just like an unclothed, like physical nakedness. Like when we're talking here in Genesis, it is not just absence of clothing. It is the absence of all walls, boundaries, like trying to shield yourself from vulnerability. Completely uncovered, no physical barriers, no emotional barriers, spiritually being completely vulnerable. Like when they were naked and unashamed, it was all of the above. Complete openness and vulnerability with each other. Spiritually one with one another, and they felt no shame. They felt no shame. Now, for a lot of us, because of the brokenness in our culture of sex and intimacy and what we see all around us, it's hard to imagine it as that, like with no shame. And especially if you've grown up in the church for a long time and in any sort of church tradition or family that may not acknowledge and talk about this stuff a lot, like we can understand this just setting up rules and don't do it and just kiss dating goodbye and let's just be done with it, right? Like we understand that. But imagine sex with no shame, nothing to hide, pure, unpolluted, delight between a man and a woman linked forever together in covenant relationship, feeling no shame at all. That is how it was designed. You see, this all happened before the fall in Genesis 3, before sin entered the world and this condition of brokenness and death and sickness entered the world in Genesis 3. This happened before that. We, mankind, humankind, were sexual before we were sinful. It is not some evil curse that we have to curb and deny ourselves and feel guilty about. Like, we were designed to express and utilize the gift of sex in the proper context before sin entered the world. And a lot of times it's easier to just manage a behavior by making it evil, bad, and saying, don't, instead of understanding the gift of it and how it can be properly used. It's a good gift that we get to experience and enjoy as long as it's in the context that marriage was intended and designed to use, or intend within marriage, how it was designed to be used. But sadly, as humans, we were born with this bent, right? This propensity to take God's gifts, the things that He's created, and turn them into God's, to make them ultimate in our lives. In his letter to the Romans, in Romans 1, 24 and 25, Paul says this, "Therefore, God gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator." So the people that he's writing here to, they worshiped created things, the gifts of God. So they worshiped food, drinks, sex, money, stuff, the earth. They worshiped all these things rather than worshiping God, the giver of those gifts. You see where that's a little backwards? They worshiped the created things instead of the Creator. There's a word for this, and it's called idolatry. When you worship the things, the gifts, instead of the giver. Now, it's interesting that Paul's first example of idolatry here was sex. And this is very telling because in this day and time, not too much unlike ourselves, the goddess of sex in the Roman world had a name. It was Aphrodite. Now, there's a temple in Ephesus to this goddess of sex. And it was stocked with over 1,000 prostitutes. And people would come from all over the land to worship with one of the prostitutes. Sounds a little backwards, right? But they would worship Aphrodite, the goddess of sex, with one of these prostitutes at the temple, meaning they would have sex with these prostitutes. And that was the form of worshiping this goddess Aphrodite. Now, step back for a second. Does this sound anything familiar with what we see all around us in society and culture today? Aphrodite is alive and well today and functions as a multi-billion-dollar industry all around us. A multi-billion-dollar industry. Entertainment, strip clubs, pornography, TV, fashion, cosmetics ads, plastic surgery. Her temple is found everywhere. Now, often we get in our nice little Northwest hub and we think that like, oh no, that stuff doesn't affect us up here. We're just like socially responsible. We're responsible with the earth. Everybody just gets along and goes hiking and riding bikes and running marathons. Welcome to Oregon. Like, that's what we're known for, right? Portland was nicknamed Pornland not too long ago by the media because it is one of the biggest hubs in North America for sex trafficking. It is one of the most saturated areas for the pornography and strip club and entertainment industry. Portland, Oregon was nicknamed Pornland. This is not far from us. The goddess of sex that people worship in a wrong way, Aphrodite, is all around us. We are not shielded or sheltered from this reality here in the Northwest. The thing about this is when we turn sex into a god, it quickly becomes a cruel tyrant in our lives. It becomes a cruel tyrant. What was supposed to function as a good gift for you to enjoy as an act of worship to the Creator becomes an addiction with a strange otherworldly power over you. It becomes an addiction. It has this power. And here's why. Sex is also powerful. In Genesis, it explains this. In Genesis 2:24, it says that two become one flesh. It was designed to be powerful. That isn't where this is broken, but it is. It has power. Becoming one flesh in Hebrew is the word echad. echad, when the lines blur between two people, between a man and a woman. When you're wrapped up so close with another human being that it becomes hard to tell who's who. Becoming one flesh, echad. It is when you know and when you are known by another person. In fact, later in the story, it says that Adam knew his wife and she became pregnant. So in Hebrew, to know is actually an idiom for sex. Like it's powerful. It's a powerful thing. And it's fitting, right? Because when you make love to another person, you experience vulnerability and you experience them at the deepest, most exposed levels. It's a vulnerable thing. You share yourself with them physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Something powerful happens in sex when two humans become echad, become one flesh. And to God, the only kind of relationship strong enough to hold and contain this power is marriage. A lifelong covenant between a husband and a wife. A lifelong covenant. It is the only container that can handle the nuclear power that we call sex. Marriage is the only container that can hold that. I find it interesting that God's view of sex is actually much higher than our culture's. Much higher than our culture's. But it's easy to miss with all the negative rhetoric that we find in the church around sex, isn't it? It's hard to miss God's view of this being a gift. Culture says it's just momentary biological coupling of two beings for a sexual release. When you get hungry, you eat. When you're tired, you sleep. When you're turned on, you have sex. It's just an appetite that needs satisfied. That's what culture says, a biological momentary coupling of two individuals. But the problem is, it's not just physical, like this minimizes it to be. God says, no, it's much more than that. It's much more than physical. It's two separate, autonomous human beings being fused together as one. It's a melding together of two souls. It really is, two becoming one. It's physical and it's spiritual. We cannot minimize it to being merely a physical thing because we are spiritual and physical beings. So we can't, they're inseparable. They're inextricably linked. We can't just say, oh no, that's just a physical thing because we don't exist that way. We are both, and therefore an action that is meant to bring that kind of depth and vulnerability cannot be parceled off and compartmentalized. It just can't be. That's why I would say that there's no such thing as casual sex. Because sex involves all of you, body, soul, heart, mind, memory, personality, the past and the present, the future you. It's all involved in this. It's not compartmentalized and you just get to pick what piece you're going to offer up in any given moment. It's all. Every time that you make love, you give a part of yourself. Now, inside of marriage, this is incredible, right? This is good news as is meant to be utilized. Sex is like gravity. It keeps you in orbit with your spouse. It keeps you in orbit with your spouse. It keeps you in sync, in tune, echad. But outside of marriage, this makes it dehumanizing and destructive. Every time you break echad, you rip yourself open, and a part of you gets lost in that. And I know that some of you in here know this pain all too well, of this dehumanizing and this destruction and feeling like you've lost a part of yourself. Because we aren't in a time or place where the fullness of how God designed this to be used is being observed. It's just not. But even with all that being said, the good news is this. The God who created sex in the beginning and said that it's very good, that it's powerful, that two become one, that they become echad, that God, the creator, is also the God of healing and forgiveness. He doesn't just say, hey, you messed up, good luck. He is the God also of healing, forgiveness, and restoration. And there's a couple things that we can do to get back in touch with how this is designed to be used. Step one, we have to address the worship problem that's inherently happening here. The worship problem. Making the creation the God and worshiping the creation instead of the creator. That's a worship problem. Who are you worshiping? Who are you offering yourself up to? What motivates you? Where is the direction of your heart? Is it to things that are created or to the one that created them? We have to stop worshiping the gift and turn to the giver with our worship. That's what we have to do. We can no longer disconnect our experience from God's intentions and redefine the meaning of life, including sexuality and the meaning of sex. We can't disconnect those. We have the opportunity not only to worship the giver, the creator, but to have a relationship with him through Jesus Christ. And that's the good news. It's not just about worshiping. Like, Jesus came to give us the opportunity to have a relationship, to satisfy those needs, to fill our voids with a relationship. Worship's not just songs we sing at church. It's a way of life. It's a way of directing our hearts and our souls and our direction, our entire lives to Jesus, and pursuing everything that will lead us to him, things that will lead us nearer to him, not separate us from him. But then we have to turn to the one who can fix us. If you have your Bibles or your app, let's turn to Luke 7. We're going to walk through something here as we prepare to wrap up. Luke 7:36 starts like this. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life, scholars believe that she was a prostitute, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. Then there's this dialogue between Jesus and the Pharisees, and they're saying things like, well, if you're really a prophet, you know that this woman's a sinner, and she's washing your feet. Why would you let her do that? And then Jesus does as he does, and he tells a little story or gives a little lesson, explaining to them why, like, this is good news that she's coming to receive forgiveness and coming to him and giving him an offering. And he reveals to them that forgiveness and love are inextricably linked in this moment. And then at the end of that whole dialogue, he says this. Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests around began to say to themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Go in peace. There's a couple things to mention here. This woman, she was a sinner. She wasn't perfect. She didn't have all her stuff together. She didn't figure everything out, reach some moment of intellectual and spiritual enlightenment and say, now all is well with my soul and I can go to Jesus. That is not what happened here. Like I said, it was commonly agreed upon that this woman was a prostitute. She was a sinner. She was wrapped up in a way of life that was not glorifying to God and that was taking her out of being able to experience this gift of sex in its fullness. So what did she do? She finds herself in this place. She comes to Jesus with a humble and repentant heart. She knew she needed to change. Something had to give. Something had to change. That's where we enter into the story. Now it says that she offered up a jar of perfume at the feet of Jesus, that she put it on his feet. Now, in this day, this was not just like a sign of reverence and respect. But on top of that, it can be assumed that this perfume was a tool of the trade for the things that she was engaged in. Does that make sense? Like the perfume back in the day, like engaged, that was like a tool of the trade for this sinful life that was indicated that she lived. I can just see this picture in my head of this woman coming to Jesus, sick of her brokenness, in a hollow shell of herself, sick of being destructive with her body and her soul, sick of experiencing this sin and this abuse that undoubtedly was happening to her, breaking open this jar and pouring perfume on Jesus' feet. Now, a lot of people would view this as wasteful and poor stewardship by those watching, but she breaks open this bottle and literally places it at the feet of Jesus, sacrificing it to him, offering it to him, to honor him. Think about this. And then he then declares that her sins are forgiven and your faith has saved you. So I ask you this question this morning. What tools of the trade do you need to lay at the feet of Jesus here this morning? What tools of the trade, what things are you holding on to in your life that are helping to identify you and identify you with worshiping the gifts instead of the giver? What things are you holding on to white-knuckled that in some twisted way may bring you comfort in a moment but ultimately leave you exposed and vulnerable and unsafe? What perfume needs to be broken at the feet of Jesus in your life here this morning? What is it? What is it? Is it seeking after attention from the opposite sex? Is it pride? Is it the gym because you need to feel that you're getting yourself ready to be loved when God is already offering that love for you? Is it a man or a woman that you're just hoping they will tell you you are pretty or you're handsome so that you can feel valued and significant? Is it money and you're pursuing it and you're just trying your hardest to hoard up and gather money so that you can feel safe and that you can feel that you can provide for yourself when ultimately the only one that can provide for you eternally is Jesus? What is the perfume bottle in your life that needs broken, just destructed at the feet of Jesus so that he can come in and by that faith save you and restore you, make you whole, give you hope once again? What is that thing? What behaviors or actions or things in your life are contributing to sexual brokenness and making things that God intended to be a good gift that you're settling? For instant gratification over eternal satisfaction. Where are we settling? What needs given to Jesus here this morning? I would ask you to call that out by name. I can just see your guys' heads spinning. Some of you know it. It's there. You know what it is. And you just desperately want Jesus to take it. But loosening that grip enough is really hard for you to actually give it up and not hold on to a piece of it. You, all of you, each person in here are much more than a body or than a companion to another human being. You are much more than that. You are sons and daughters of the one who created this earth and knew you in your mother's womb when he began to create you. He knows much more about you, more than you could ever imagine. Who can know more about us than the one who created us? You are more than that to him. And he's calling us this morning to no longer settle for temporal things, but give a little bit of sacrifice to receive eternal satisfaction and fulfillment in the areas of sex and whatever other areas you're struggling with in your life. You see this worship problem? Yes, we're talking about it in the confines of relationships and sex this morning. But this worship problem is perversive in our entire lives, in our entire culture. It's not just here. This worship problem happens at jobs. It happens with what vehicle you drive. It happens with who's got the biggest house, who's got the nicest car, who's the smartest, who can get better grades, what kind of degree, how many PhDs. All these things become forms of worship instead of avenues for us to worship the one who gave us the gift to even participate in them in the first place. Where are you settling for something temporary that God has much more for you? I ask you that this morning. Worship team, you guys can head up here. 1 Peter 2:24 says this: He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. By his wounds you have been healed. That healing, that sacrifice of Jesus offering up his body to sin so that we could be freed from it, that's not just like for a couple of you in here. That's for everybody that would turn to him, repent, meaning turn from your old way of life and your old behaviors and the things that are causing you destruction and separation from Jesus. Turn to him and receive his hope, his healing, his forgiveness in your life. That's who that's for. That's not just a lottery ticket. That's not just a lottery ticket. That is all-encompassing, all-covering. God desires for you all, each one of us in here, to experience that this morning. For all of us. For all of us. More of the same will not heal this area of your life. More of the same won't do it. It just won't. Something needs to change. It needs to change now. I would urge you, give it to Jesus. What does that look like? If you would like help walking through that and calling these things out by name and processing through and praying through these things, like come to a life group, come talk to somebody at the Connect table afterwards. Let us pray for you. Let us walk through this with you. You cannot fight this battle, go down this path alone. It's not meant to be an individual thing that we just figure out on our own. It's meant to be done in relationship with one another. Please don't do this alone. Don't do this alone. The thoughts and feelings about yourself, give them to Jesus. Experience freedom, his healing, and his restoration in your life.